Hello, everybody. Welcome back. You're listening to doing the radio, Corpus Christi Outreach Ministry. We're going to do Romans chapter 11, 12, and 13. And I'm going to do one more Romans video, the last three chapters. In 2 weeks from now, I guess we'll finish it. And I'm going to start transitioning. I'll do a little bit today. Going to do a little history, world history, church history. I'm going to finish philosophy posts. We've got a long way to go on those. We stopped in the early, before the time of Christ, and we're going to have to get into, I want to get into, when we do finish the philosophy, we're going to do theology and philosophy hand in hand because St. Augustine, 4th century bishop, theologian, was also in the field of philosophies. Thomas Aquinas, the great Catholic thinker, Dr. Angelicus of the Catholic Church. He's from the 13th century. Duns Scotus. These men you have in the field of philosophy and theology. So if you study theology in the universities, you'll run into these guys. Or if you study philosophy, you'll run into them. So what I'm going to do at the end of this Romans, we'll cover these three chapters, and I'm going to start moving into, I'm going to do a little of the Renaissance period, how that had an effect on. I said in the beginning of these teachings, had a talk the other day. I was talking to some of my college friends and some of my other friends, and I might cover some of these things because I was doing it. And we're going to talk about Renaissance man today and where that term comes from and how that fits in. But Romans 11, I'll do a brief overview. It's been a while since we've done the Romans. In Romans, we've really hit so far. When you get to chapter 3 all the way to chapter 8, that's the main body, in my view, of Romans. Chapter 2 to chapter 8, right in there. And you get the real great theology of Paul. Now, we still got some good things in these chapters, but that's the main thing, so I'm not going to be quoting as much right now. But in Romans 11, Paul, throughout the letter, was making an argument, which is a foundational argument. It was really what the Protestant Reformation divided on with the Catholic Church. And in my view, that I don't like the division. I think that the church should be unified, but this did happen. But it was over this issue of what we call justification by faith. And that was the big one. And in those following this, you see that I've put both views in, and I think there's credence to both views of how the church, Rome, saw also the need for good works in the life of the believer. And so because Paul, throughout this letter, was so strong on saying natural Israel, the Jewish people, did not obtain that which they sought after. Now, what were they seeking after? The righteousness of God. They were trying to say, by our covenant with God and the old covenant and keeping of the law and all of this, we're going to try to be pleasing to God through. And Paul will say in this letter, they didn't obtain it because they sought it not by faith, but as it were by works. And that's a big theme in this letter. Now, obviously, this letter is going to the believers at Rome, but there's also a big Jewish audience that's going to read Paul's letter. So it's kind of, he's already got a lot of enemies. And you read church history in the book of Acts, Paul has a lot of enemies with his Jewish brethren of the first century. And this you see in Acts 13, Acts 15, the divisions, the first tribe. We're going to go long today. I got a lot to cover. So Paul had he had been slandered by people, and the Jewish people really hated Paul, a lot of them. So when this letter of Paul finally is going to go to Rome, and they're going to hear from him, what do you think they're going to think when they read the first few chapters? Paul saying, basically like Stephen's great sermon in Acts chapter 7, the first martyr. Stephen taught, it's really a great sermon, and he says to his Jewish brethren, he covers the history of the Jewish nation and how God made covenant promises to them, and then he says, and you, Peter, you see the same thing in the book of Acts, and you Jewish people, my brothers, he says, and you slew him on a tree, and some of this language, his Jewish friends were like, what? No wonder these guys were getting martyred. Now, Paul's letter goes to Rome, and they're reading this. the first three chapters. You Jewish people didn't get what you thought you were going to get, but the Gentiles got it. All of these themes are also in the parables of Jesus. There's a lot of confusion among Christians when they preach the parables of Jesus, because there's verses like the children of the kingdom are going to be cast out. Those who have all, it's talking about the beneficiaries of the old covenant, not Christians being cast out of the kingdom, but they were the initial children of the kingdom, the Jewish nation. And this theme is in the new covenant, and it's in this chapter. So Paul now is going to say to the Jewish people, and he says in chapter 11, did God then forsake them? And Paul saying, am I preaching that all the Jews have no hope? And he says, God forbid. He says, they were the original heirs of the covenant. They're the natural branch, the natural root and branch is from them. And Paul says to the Gentiles, to us, he says, and you were wild olive branches, and God grafted you in. He brought you into this covenant. We read these themes in the letter of Ephesians as well. So, us Gentiles, God brought us into the covenant promises. It says in Ephesians, we were without hope. We were without hope, without God in the world, and God was gracious to bring us into the commonwealth of Israel. So now Paul is saying, there is hope. And then he'll quote Psalms. There's a lot of quotes from the Old Testament from Paul, but he'll quote 1 Kings, chapter 19. I should tell this story, because Paul will say, don't you remember the story of Elijah? How Elijah said to God, I'm the only one left, God. I'll get to that in a second. And what was God's reply to Elijah, the prophet? He says, I have 7,000 knees that have not bowed the knee to Baal. Meaning this story is good. 1 Kings 18:19, famous story amongst Bible readers. And Elijah was a prophet in the Old Testament prophets. And Israel, God's people, were rebelling, going astray. And you had King Ahab, and his wife was Jezebel. Very famous, Jezebel. So Elijah's this great prophet, and he does all these prophetic signs. The book of James, the half-brother of Jesus, step-brother, half-brother, wrote the epistle to James, and he quotes about Elijah. He says, Elijah was a man subject to passion and sufferings just like us. Yet he prayed that it would not rain for 3.5 years, and it didn't rain, and then he prayed again, and it rained. Well, this is that story, 1 Kings 18:19. So Elijah is always the prophetic mantle, prophets of the Old Testament. And one time Elijah prophesied there's going to be no rain in the land, and like a judgment of God. And then he goes into hiding for 3 years. Nobody can find him. And King Ahab, there's this economic, judgment on the land. There's no rain. Ahab's looking for him. Where's Elijah? He's ruining everything for us. He's got people out hunting him down. And Elijah's just in hiding for 3 years. Tough, huh? To go away for 3 years. And then one day Elijah pops up. He runs into one of the servants of Ahab, who was friendly to the prophets of God. And Elijah says, the guy's shocked. I think his name's Obadiah or something like that. And Elijah says, go tell him, Ahab, I'm here. And the guy's scared. He says, look, he's been looking all over for you. If I go tell him you're here and then you run off again, he's going to kill me. And Elijah says, no, tell him I'm here. It's his confrontation. and the king was blaming Elijah for all the problems and all. And Elijah says, it's not my fault. It's your fault. He says, you forsook God. You did all these things against God's law. This is your fault. You just happened to be run into a prophet, and you didn't realize that in the beginning, did you, Ahab? So Elijah kind of gives him that little, thing. And he says there's going to be rain, but there's this great confrontation. Now, we're getting to this quote that I just quoted in Romans 11, where Paul says, did you not read when Elijah said, I'm the only one left? This is the story. So there's this confrontation with the prophets of Baal, and they all make this big wooden sacrifice, and they put a bull on it, and Elijah says, call to your fake God and see if he'll burn this sacrifice. And Elijah then calls upon God, the true God, and the sacrifice is burnt, and this is great victory. But he kills 450 false prophets of Jezebel. And so 1 Kings 18, you got this great victory. And he goes running, and, then this empowerment story that God strengthened him. And then word gets to Jezebel. She sends a servant to Elijah, go tell Elijah, he's gonna be like one of these prophets by tomorrow. And Elijah gets scared, starts running. He's got all the signs of bipolar disorder in 1 Kings 19. He runs in the wilderness. He says, "Okay, God, I did you well. I'm ready to die. Go ahead and take my life." God says, he's kind of secluded, hiding out in a cave, and God says, that's the time where Elijah says, "I'm the only one serving you," you know. And God says, "There's 70,000 that I have not, that have not bowed the knee to Baal." So that was it. That's the quote. You got the whole Bible story of the quote. Romans 11, and Paul will make the argument and say, no, blindness in part is happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles be come in. He says, man, if I have a coughing fit, I'm going to have a hard time. Paul says God permitted blindness, that they could not see the truth of Christ and the gospel at the time of the appearing of Christ, that he was the Messiah. God did it for the benefit of us as Gentiles. So their blindness was a blessing to us. We now have mercy. Now, God says, you Gentiles, don't think of yourselves, wow, we are, don't be high-minded, but fear, we stand by faith. He says, because now what God is doing in the church is he's creating a jealousy among the natural Israel. They see our relationship with God and Messiah, who was their Messiah, is now our Messiah. And that remnant, that 7,000 that was a remnant, Paul even said there's a remnant today. Paul was Jewish. And the early apostles, prophets, teachers were all Jewish. And then the message is going out to the Gentiles. So Paul says, look, there's a remnant today, according to the election of grace and not of works. Those who God chose out of the Jewish nation as well as the Gentiles. It's all a matter of grace, and God did this. So, chapter 11. That's it. I'll move fast here. Chapter 12. I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service or spiritual worship. And be not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your minds, that ye may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. Now, chapter 12, ethics again. You always have ethics in the letters, morality. And Paul talks about our bodies being given unto God as a sacrifice. That's what he wants. The sacrifice of a life lived for him, separated unto his purposes. He also talks about what we call body ministry. You read about this in Corinthians. Paul says there are many gifts, apostles and gifts, and all of us have different gifts, but all of these gifts are for the benefit of everybody. So body ministry, it means we all have these functions, but none of us are really supposed to be the main person in the community of the church, what we call local church, meaning the community of people of God. We all have gifts that are to be operating freely. And so this gets into ecclesiology, and I wrote a few books on this on the site, but Paul is telling them, don't think that the speaker among you, the prophet among you, or whatever, use the gifts. They're there to be used, so use them, but use them to build up the body. It's not something that you should be treated special in the sense of you're higher than another. We give honor to whom honor is due. We're going to get to that next chapter, chapter 13. But Paul encourages them, use the gifts to benefit one another. Then there's a little bit in the end of chapter 12, sort of like the Sermon on the Mount of Christ. He says, don't take vengeance, don't get even, bless your enemies, feed them, bless them that persecute you, overcome evil with good, don't repay evil for evil. In doing so, you will heap hot coals upon their heads. And that's a verse from the Gospels, from Jesus, I think, from part of the teaching of Christ. But meaning this, bless people, and God will deal with people. And he deals with them. This is a verse. It quotes it. Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord, I will repay. That comes, I think, somewhere out of an Isaiah or a Psalms quote. And it's not get them, so, we get even. God's wrath in Scripture is redemptive, okay? Now, we'll get to chapter 13. I think it's 13. But we're going to maybe I already, there's a verse about universalism. I think we just passed it. I'll mention this in a minute. Universalism, I don't believe in it fully, but it's a belief among some Christians that God will save everybody someday. And there's a big debate on these things. And there are verses people use, but there's a verse that Paul will quote again out of Psalms in these chapters, and he says, all Israel shall be saved. Have you not read, there shall come out of Zion the deliverer, and shall turn away ungodliness from Jacob. That's another quote from the Psalms. So Paul will quote that. And that term, among theologians and scholars, we can get into, they can get into big things over a little term. What does it mean, all Israel shall be saved? In the post and the commentary that I wrote years ago, that's coinciding with these videos, I talk about that. But in context, I think that Paul is saying, look, there's a redemption coming to Israel. And when they see Christ at the second coming, there's prophecies in Zechariah, they will look upon him whom they have pierced, and the spirit of supplication will fall upon them. So, as far as if you do a fair reading of that, it looks like Paul is talking a little bit about a universalism, meaning the Jewish people at the end, they're going to see Christ, they're going to see at the resurrection, at the judgment, they're going to see it's him. He was the Messiah. He's the pierced one. This is the Messiah we're waiting for. Like the Apostle Thomas, who was doubting Thomas, when he saw Jesus, Jesus says, go ahead and put your hands into my side, into my wounds. That was the recognition. So there's a prophecy, I think it's Zechariah, it says, they will look upon him whom they have pierced. How will they know that it's the one they pierced or the one who was crucified? Because of those wounds. So it seems like Paul's saying at that moment there will be a nation will be born in a day. These are actual verses I'm quoting. It's a form of universalism. They'll see, they'll believe, and they'll repent. Now, I bring that up because it's in these chapters. And Paul in chapter 12 is saying, for us to use our gifts for the benefit of all the people. And God has a purpose, and don't get even with people. God, this is why I came up, God's judgment, vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. It's focused towards redemption. So if God says, there's a scripture that says, if judgment must begin at the house of God, what will the end be for those who obey not the gospel? Peter, that's in Peter. So God begins judgment in his people. Paul says in Corinthians, when we are judged, we are chastened of the Lord. 1 Corinthians, I think, 11 or something in there. So we will not be condemned with the world. So God purges us, judges us. We are chastened. The Hebrews, God disciplines us. But there's a judgment coming to the unbeliever, to the world. Now that judgment is different. But the judgment of God is all purposed. It says in Hebrews, we had earthly fathers who disciplined us for their pleasure. But God disciplines us to produce holiness. So God's judgment upon even the world, I believe, is redemptive in nature. Now, there was a big debate. I'm going to go an hour today because I'm looking at my thing and I got to do the Renaissance. I got to do a lot. And there was a big debate in the church a few years ago. In charismatic circles, Protestant circles, there's a lot going on. But there was this pastor, minister, Carlton Pearson, very famous, charismatic, and he started his own church. And then he wrote a big book. I was going to read it one day because I'm familiar with all these things. And he wanted $60 for that book. I said, no, it ain't that good. I know what you taught, and I'm not going to get it. He basically embraced universalism, said everyone's going to be saved. Oh, and there was, a lot of the charismatic preachers, Oral Roberts preachers, you're going to go to hell and all. There are many people that believe this. There's a few scriptures they use that God wills that all men will be saved. Jesus, there's a theme in the New Testament, almost at times, that says, you're all under the covenant. It's kind of right in there. You're all been redeemed by God's grace. Therefore, believe now. So there's this little form of this that you read. And there's a doctrine called annihilationism. There's a verse in Isaiah, and it says that the judgment, that they will be destroyed with everlasting destruction from the presence of the Lord. Revelation says death and hell will be cast into the lake of fire. These verses kind of, smart people, Christians, said, well, maybe the judgment of God is not necessarily the classical view of hell. Now, I'm going to do Renaissance in a few minutes. We have Dante and his great Inferno. That was right in the 12. Dante lived in the 1200s, 1300s, 13th, 14th century. So these were classical views of hell that some people debated. And one of the first theologians in the 3rd century, I believe, the 200s, was Origen. His name was Origen. And he believed in universalism, and he believed that Satan himself would be saved at the end. And Origen, founded the first Christian school out of Alexandria, Egypt. And he taught this. And most people, I read a lot of church history, most people look kindly upon Origen. But when Carlton Pearson came up with the same view, he was very, maligned. And I talked to friends at the time when they were all debating, oh, Carlton Pearson's a universalist. He thinks everyone's going to be saved. I said, well, I don't hold that view. I said, but there's people that hold it. It's not, there's some founding for some different beliefs. Classical Christianity, Catholic, Protestant, I'll give it to you now, does not hold to universalism, meaning everyone will be saved. Also, there's an eternal judgment. It's an everlasting judgment. There's a judgment of the just and the unjust. That's the view I hold, okay? I'm not a universalist. When you come against upon these scriptures, you deal openly with them. Okay, chapter 13, because I got to do some Renaissance today. Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, is verse 1 I'm quoting. For the powers that be are ordained of God. There's no power unless God permits it. Authority, civil authorities, therefore submit. Now, it says that for the same reason pay your taxes, because the same thing, we're witnesses in society. But then it says but because the powers of the authorities, cops and all, it says they are not a terror to good works, but to evil. If you do wrong, then fear. But if you do good, don't fear. And a lot of stuff I'm dealing with, yes, but if you're dealing with governments or systems that are corrupt, meaning you might do well and still have to worry about corruption, whether it's the Egyptian security forces cops that people complained about in Egypt for years, or many of the shootings across the country that people are talking about in our country. So civil authority only really, you submit to civil authority, you obey all the laws, but when civil authority becomes corrupt, God does not, I put in the post corresponding to the video, I put parts of the Catechism of the Catholic Church that I'm adding in there, and I put one on civil authorities, and it says this thing. It's very interesting. But it says, is there ever a time for civil disobedience? We read about that in Scripture times, where Peter says, should we obey God rather than man, when they said, don't preach in the name of Jesus? Overall, we obey the law, and we should be examples into society that we're people that obey the law. But there are also times where authority, I'm going to look at my notes a little bit, we're covering a lot. There are times where authorities do wrong, and God is not in any way justifying the wrong things that authorities do. All right, those are the 3 chapters. I want to do a little bit of Renaissance and a little world history here at the end. And how does it fit in? Part of the reason that I'm reading Romans to you, and it's very popular, the book of Romans, I covered this in the beginning, is because the Protestant movement, it was a restoration of the reading of Scripture again. And how did that come about? In the Renaissance, the Renaissance is studying just history itself, is a period that started about the 13th, 14th century, out of Florence, Italy. This is the European Renaissance, the Western Renaissance. Renaissance means rebirth. The term means rebirth. And what was it a rebirth of? It was a rebirth of classical culture, wisdom, understanding. And then you had the artists, the great Renaissance artists. So this is what the Renaissance is. You had an earlier Renaissance that was taking place in the Muslim world. It's interesting to know this. And they were already trying to syncretisms, sort of like bring in the philosophers, the ones I was teaching, Aristotle and Plato and their thought, and to reintroduce their understandings, their knowledge into the religious realm. And the Muslims were doing this prior to the Christian Renaissance. And the beginning of the Renaissance, there was a restoration of this classical learning. Now, at first, it was not Christian or religion based, but it became very influential, and the church did embrace it. It did have an impact. There was a man, there's a famous family out of Florence, Italy in the 1300s, 1300s, called the Medicis, the Medici family. And there was a man by the name of Cosimo de' Medici. And they were very influential bankers and cultural guys. And he was a lover of the church, Catholic man. And many of the Renaissance artists were there at the time of his family. One of his family members took in either Michelangelo or Da Vinci, or one of them down the line. They were later, but eventually one of the family members from the Medici family housed one of these great Renaissance artists. And so he and that family allowed and opened up this new understanding, this new cultural windows are open. That was the catchphrase of Vatican II, 1962. The windows are now going to be opened, and we're going to be, receiving all the wonderful things God has. So this was a form of what we call humanism. Now, Renaissance humanism is not like the term we associate today. Today, if you say humanism amongst Christians, it's derogatory because we think secular humanism, meaning, no God, no Christianity, secular humanism. But the humanism of the Renaissance was just different. It's the values of human people, and God gave us these great gifts, and let's use them. And then you have the artists and the great artists, the Renaissance artists, not in the 1300s, but 1600s, 15th century, 16th century. Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Raphael. These are considered the Renaissance artists, and Da Vinci has his famous work, the painting, the fresco, the painting, Christian painting on the Sistine Chapel at the Vatican, and is very well known. And so these were all part of this cultural restoration. Now, the catchphrase for Renaissance is ad fontes, Adfontes, meaning back to the sources. They were rediscovering the writings of Aristotle and rediscovering all this ancient wisdom, and that's what sparked it. And in the 1400s, the 15th century, you had the fall of this great capital of Constantinople. The Ottoman Empire, the Ottomans toppled it. And then there was a lot of writings from the monasteries that were preserved, and these writings were held in the Catholic monasteries, churches and all, and Aristotle and all these things too. And so these things came open, and that everyone had access to these things. So they said, that was played a role in it. Modern Constantinople, big role in church history. In the 4th century I told you we're going to do some history today. 4th century, you had Emperor Constantine. Constantine was the Roman emperor that made Christianity, the Edict of Constantine made Christianity the religion of the whole Holy Roman Empire at the time. And the Rome was the headquarters, if you will, of that time in the Western world. But Constantine wanted to also establish sort of like Rome in the eastern part of the empire, the Byzantine Empire. And so that city was called Constantinople, after Constantine. Eventually, over the centuries, there were fights because the church and government were very mixed at that time. You didn't really have separation of church and state. And in the eastern part of the empire, which is Byzantium, Constantinople, you had a bishop. You had basically 5 main bishops. I forget them. Jerusalem, maybe Antioch, of course Rome. But the debate of these 5 bishops was, are they all equal in power? And then as time went on, the eastern part of the empire, Constantinople part, began to say, we don't like the influence of the Roman bishop over us. as the Pope type bishop, because we are our people over here, eastern part, you're in the western part. So some of the debates went that way. And the officials split. The first, what we call Great Schism in Christianity, took place in 1054 AD. Constantinople, the eastern part, Byzantine Empire, the eastern part, divided finally with Rome. And Rome, the Bishop of Rome, called the Pope, wanted to, over a period of time, have the primacy amongst all the bishops. And Constantinople did finally break in that religious sense. This is where you have the Eastern Orthodox churches coming from that tradition. So, you got a big history with Constantinople, okay? And during the Crusades, it was a major thoroughfare. You go into Jerusalem, and the Crusades are fighting, and you see this in movies and stuff. But it's Constantinople was that like gateway. So the fall of Constantinople, again in the 15th century, which is 1400s, by the Ottomans, released all of these wonderful writings. Okay, so you see history in the church here. Now, the Renaissance men, the term is polymath. Okay, polymath or Renaissance man, meaning having learned much. That's what that means. Having learned much, or having a universal knowledge of more than one field. That's where the term eventually for university comes from. Universal knowledge, all right? And in the historic universities or schools, theology was the main subject, and philosophy was her handmaiden. The term is theology was the queen of education, and philosophy was her handmaiden. But at the time of the Renaissance, they wanted to introduce more, okay, not so much dependent upon just theology, the study of God himself. And so you had what's called universal knowledge, or university then was you're going to learn at the university. You're going to learn a lot of subjects. Leonardo da Vinci, the great artist, was a Renaissance man. He had a lot of knowledge and wisdom in many fields. And so this was looked upon highly. Now, when you had the restoration of these old writings ad fontes, back to the sources, how did this affect everything about Christianity, Protestant Christianity, the book of Romans? There was a man by the name of Desiderius Erasmus in the 1400s, 1500s, right there at the time, right before the Reformation. And he was what we call a Catholic humanist. Humanism in the better sense of the term that I said a minute ago. So what he did was restored a translation of the Bible in the original Greek language for the priests and others to understand, as far as the Latin versions that they were using. And this was the original Greek translation that Erasmus worked on. And this allowed, for the first time, some of the priests and teachers to really start reading the original sources, ad fontes, see, back to the sources. And this book we're studying, Romans, and justification by faith and all, was a big, shock, because many of the priests and good Catholic people at the time, they didn't see the freedom of righteousness, the gift of God's salvation. They really were in too much of a mindset that they were unable to see the great truths of God. Now, in my view, when the Protestants totally jumped ship, Erasmus didn't jump ship. He said, I'm going to work for reform within the church that I love. I like Erasmus' view better than what the Lutherans did, okay? Even though I'm Christian, I have Catholic parts of me, Protestant parts. But Erasmus was smart. He didn't want to take pay, salary type for his teaching. He wanted to be an independent teacher. And back then it was hard. You had to get your own books and stuff. It's not internet day. You could wiki things and all. And Erasmus wrote in the language of the scholars, because he didn't want to, Greek and Latin, he didn't want to start a big firestorm amongst the general population. But Luther's Reformation was in the common language, and when he nailed the famous 95 questions theses on the door at the university at Wittenberg, it was in the common language. So all the students could see what was going on. And so they had different views how they were going to approach things. That's why the Renaissance was important, because it restored a big part of what happened in Christianity. Um, do a little cultural thing here. At this time of the European Renaissance, what I'm discussing about the 13th, 17th centuries, you had a whole host of all types of knowledge and wisdom, and you had the rise of really capitalism. You had money that was used, a system of bartering. You always had some system of it. We read about coins and stuff in the New Testament. But you didn't have money as a commodity until really the time of the Renaissance, meaning money itself could be loaned out on interest and all, and it was considered the historic church, and Muslims still believe this, that it was a sin to get interest. Where do people get that from, John? It's in the Bible. Don't take interest, don't charge interest and all. But the church at that time changed its view, because money now, for the new explorations, see Christopher Columbus, this was a time of Columbus's, one of the new ventures of capitalism was what? The discovery and the going out for adventures and financing for these ventures. And Columbus was going to find a route, a new trade route, and he found, America. But how did he get the funding? It's famous. He had to get the funding from Spain, and I think it was Isabella. But you get the funding for your journey. You want to go out on a ship and go explore, go ahead, and you had to raise money. This came about at this time in the Renaissance. And the money that these explorers would borrow, whatever they would find in the new worlds or the new places, any of the value of the thing, 75% went back to whoever funded your expedition. And then the 25% went to the shipmasters and his men and his crew. So this system arose at that time, and you had a lot of new inventions and discoveries. And when you discovered a scientific revolution, the understanding of the scientific method of induction and deduction, we'll gather all the facts, we'll look at everything, induction, and then deduction. And we'll come to observations, scientific method, all at this time, at the scientific revolution. Now, the Copernican revolution took place. This was called right at the time of the Reformation, right in the 1500 period there. And what is that, John? For many years, the understanding of the cosmos, of the solar system of their time, our time, there was a view of the cosmos, solar system, called the Ptolemaic view. And where does this come from, John? The Ptolemaic view go all the way back, about 300 years before the time of Christ. You had the great philosophers. Socrates, famous student was Plato. Plato's most famous student was Aristotle. Aristotle's most famous student was Alexander the Great. And Alexander the Great was a great conqueror. And Alexander conquered much. And he instituted what we call Hellenization, which I discuss. I'm not going to do that right now. But in his adventures, it's been said that Alexander's conquests was the most expensive scientific expeditions ever until the modern age of NASA and the space age, because he took teams of scientists with him on these conquests, and they collected lots of things and stuff, and so they were very smart. And Alexander's kingdom, when he died, his rule, Greek rule, Seleucid things, broke into four commanders under him. This is written about in the book of Daniel, by the way, in the Old Testament. And one of those commanders was Ptolemy, Ptolemy. And from Ptolemy and his family, there were a lot of Ptolemies. They were part of them were smart guys, and they developed a system of the solar system, which is called the Ptolemaic view. And it was sort of like, I have a globe here, but I can't take it down because it's glued to my wall, so don't fall. But their system of the solar system, they didn't all think the Earth was flat until the time of Galileo. So many misconceptions amongst people. Well, I'm lighting it backwards here. They thought the Earth was like the Earth, round, and there were all these stars around the Earth. And so they had a view of the Earth, an oval. If I had a ball, I'd get it. But you had the Earth. You had sort of like a crystalline sphere around the Earth. Just picture the Earth with a glass, a globe around it. And they worked out a system that is for the seasons. This was important for people that were doing agriculture and farming, and they needed to know seasons and times and all. And as it turned, you had the stars appearing at different times. And that's how they explained it. It wasn't that far off for 300 years before the time of Christ. And by the way, in that system, you did not have Pluto in that system as a planet. They didn't know what the planets were. I'll do that in a second. But Pluto was not in there. And later we had it in there. And of course, now we dumped Pluto. So they had that part right. Even 20s, over 2,000 years ago, we're talking. But there was a kink in the system. They did not recognize that the planets and stars were different. You just were looking at the stars, and these few stars, and the term for the ones that weren't acting right were called wanderers. Wanderers. And so they had to figure that out, and there were adjustments made. But the system, the Ptolemaic view of the solar system, our cosmos, was that, and it lasted all the way into the time of the Renaissance and the scientific revolution. Why did it change, John? Okay, it was a time of inventions, and what did we invent? Lots of things. Telescopes and microscopes. And what did the microscopes? Great breakthrough in the field of science. Many of the great thinkers were Christians. The Jesuits, priests were the great thinkers, and out of the percentage of scientists, they made the highest percentage of scientists at the time of the scientific revolution than anybody else. The Catholic Jesuits, the thinkers of the church. So, church is right in here, Christianity is right in here. But with Galileo, the invention of the telescope did what for us? Can look through it and get a little better view of the Ptolemaic view. But it was Copernicus, the Copernican revolution, that made the transition. Galileo, of course, was in there, and Kepler. Kepler's mathematical calculations were used, but they could look through the telescope and say, we see some things that are different. And what did they see? Some people think they were looking at the earth as flat around. No. They all understood the way it was, the Ptolemaic view. But the Ptolemaic view was geocentric, meaning everything went around the earth in the Ptolemaic view. So the earth, geocentricity, the earth would have been the center of our solar system. And the breakthrough, the Copernican revolution, was no, everything's going around in our solar system. The sun is the center. That's called heliocentricity. It's heliocentric. That was it. And there's a lot of criticism of the church because they say Galileo was trying to get the bishops to look through the telescope, and they didn't want to look through. How true these stories are, we never know. People don't know Galileo's initial predictions, initial idea had things wrong. He had some stuff wrong, and it had to make adjustments. The mathematical formulas of Kepler made these adjustments. So there was some legitimate reason to reject Galileo. But anyway, this is all taking place. Scientific revolution, the Renaissance, all of these things are taking place in this almost like this new season of modern understanding. I'm looking at my notes real quick. Modern understanding. And it played a big role. A lot of people thought there was going to come a time where the church would cast off all of its, ignorant beliefs in demons and angels, and, we're advancing, and this played into that. And but the mistake that the nihilistic thinkers, the atheistic guys, later on we have, I'll cover this someday, Sartre and Camus, and the guys that were saying there was a whole movement before Sartre and Camus that said, now we're going to advance and finally get rid of this dark ages of religion as well, and this dark ages of God, and so man could fully advance. And they thought, some of the atheists thought, yes, that's going to happen, but they were wrong. And some of the greatest thinkers were Christians, and they argued for but you have to have some type of a belief I think it was Kant, Immanuel Kant, or John Locke, maybe. I confuse them. I always confuse those two, but they said now, in order for civil society to work, which we just did a little bit in Romans 13, there has to be some belief in an ultimate answer. When you went into the field of physics, we didn't disprove God. There's so many misconceptions in physics. In a nutshell, everything we study, if we learn anything we can ever learn, if we discover the Higgs boson, it's accepted now, even though there's a little question. Even if you find particles that we deemed unfindable at one time, all of that is the study of matter, whether it's seen matter or unseen matter. And matter is intriguing and wonderful, and if there are multiverses, but there's no scientific explanation how these things came into existence just by the studying of the things themselves. And some people argue that if we study these things long enough, we will prove that we found one thing that proves it all came from nothing. That's what these guys are doing. And no matter how much, Higgs bosons you find, there's something we call teleology. Teleology is when you're arguing for the cosmos and all of the great things we learn, there's order to everything. And all of these tremendous calculations that we didn't know needed to fit everything, now we know, wow, this intricate design. What's the explanation? Some people are, initially, they're using terms that are not even grammatically correct. You have people today, smart people say, where'd everything come from? All things came by chance. Look, that term, chance, when people make a statement like that, you don't have to be a scientist. I'm not a physicist to know that that's a nonsensical statement. All things came from chance. What do you mean? Do you know chance is a word? It's not a thing. You say, John, well, we know that. No, you don't. If you believe that story, you didn't know it. Because when people make that statement grammatically, you're ascribing ontological status to the word chance. Ontology is the study of the nature of being. The study of the nature of being. And when you say all things came from chance, you are ascribing ontological status to the word chance. All things don't come from something that is nothing, okay? Now, I understand what people mean when they use that term. They mean, well, everything came just accidentally. There was this. No, everything could not have come accidentally, because you have the law of cause and effect. You have to have a first cause. So that's not an answer. That's not a scientific answer to say everything came by chance. And if you keep studying the things that we study, which is the field of physics, the study of physical things, philosophy, and the metaphysics outside of the physical realm, no matter how much you study in physics, you are studying the physical thing. And you're still not giving us an answer for where all matter came from. And the great breakthroughs of modern physics in the 20th century with Einstein and others, we learned that time, matter, space, and energy had a beginning point. Okay, most modern people now, they're starting to question the Big Bang Theory because they realize they got caught, some of the atheists. But I believe in the Big Bang Theory, meaning there was a point of singularity, infinitesimal point, and from that point everything started. And before that point, there was nothing except some eternal thing that had to be non-physical. You have to have that. There had to be a cause, and it wasn't material. Why? Because time, space, matter, and energy all started at that point of singularity. So before the point, you don't have matter. So you add something. Why did you have to have something? Because you can't have an effect without a cause. So you had to have something, okay? That something had to be non-material. Now I'm giving you physics here, okay? That non-material something that was the cause for the effect of everything else. Could it have been a non-material thing that was non-intelligent? By observation, no, because everything we observe in the known universe that spawns intelligence is intelligent. Anything that has order to it, this is teleology. You see order and design in the universe. Therefore, there's got to be some mind behind it that had some effect. So in the field of physics, you're not disproving God. It's funny because what some of the atheistic physicists have been doing is, I'll give you a little parable. If I walked out on the beach and I found a hard drive of a computer or a CD compact disc, and if I found that computer and I was living in another age that computers never existed, and I said, look at this computer, how did it get here? My friend is there, and my friend says, I think somebody made that computer. And I say, no, I don't believe in somebody made that computer. I'm going to pick this computer up and bring it to my lab, and I'm going to prove to you that nobody made this computer. And my friend might say, well, it's obvious somebody made it. I mean, how else do you think it got there? I take it to my lab and I start working on it, physics. And I tear down the hard drive, and all of a sudden I find all of this information on the hard drive. And I tell my friend, look, this is why the screen has all this stuff on it. I found the hard drive. I told you nobody made this. Now, my friend's answer would be, all you discovered was information on the hard drive. You did not give me any explanation of who put that information there. And my friend would say, I believe an intelligent mind programmed that information on that hard drive. That's what's going on in physics. You can find the most intricate Higgs bosons, a million of them if you want. You can have 10 billion zillion universes if you want. None of that explains how did everything come from nothing. It had to come from some non-material. So all the physics in the world is a wonderful study. But when you project things like everything came by chance, nonsensical things, you're fooling people by doing that stuff. So today we went long. This is the longest video I ever made, and I wanted you to see as we study and learn. I just one look at my notes at the end. As we study and learn Christianity, we're going to do some more philosophy. Christianity and all these fields go together, okay? And even the great Renaissance period, which I'm a lover of the Renaissance, even that time period had an effect on us progressing even in the field of Christianity because we got back to the sources, the Greek Bible. I want to end in prayer, and we're going to do one more Romans video, which will be the last 3 chapters, and I'll close up on that. And I'm not sure what exactly we're going to do next, but we're going to do a little more of world history like I just did. Let's pray. Father, I thank you for all of our online community that gets to watch these videos and read the side. And what I pray, Lord, is Jesus said, the sower sows the word. He plants it. He sends it out. And what I pray is that you'd bless the people, that they would have a good understanding, maybe things they didn't understand before, and that it would bear fruit all over the earth. We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. God bless you guys.